Very warm welcome, everyone. When Vivi Tulumidi invited me for a lecture on artistic methodologies from the past which need to be reappreciated and revived in the present, I immediately had to think of the many visual artists who in the late 1960s, early 1970s, developed artistic strategies to reclaim, repurpose, and redevelop territories which had been degraded by industrial use or otherwise inappropriate human activities, to foster ecological change or to otherwise employ inventive methodologies to physically transform local ecologies. Whereas few of them are still widely recognized today, many of these artists are still largely unknown to a wider visual art audience, or have nowadays even fallen into oblivion. Especially many female artists working in this field, who often juxtapose feminist and ecological issues, have never received the recognition they deserve. Departing from my practice as a museum curator who has showcased many of these artists over the years, in this brief and somewhat dense lecture, called a sketch if you wish, I will introduce some of these ecofeminist artists and the methodologies which they developed. Let me first draw the scene, and we move to the PowerPoint here. Let me draw the scene and start at the Agent Orange sprinkled, the napalm-bombed scorched earth of Vietnam. The war in Vietnam sparked and fueled many socio-political movements of the time. In the first place, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, and the emerging women's liberation movement. These tendencies are perhaps best exemplified and merged in the proto-feminist War series by American artist Nancy Spero. In this series, a personal attempt at exorcism, as Nancy Spero described the series, the artist merges her anger at American crimes against humanity in Vietnam with her own powerlessness as an invisible female artist in a male-dominated art world. In these visual indictments, an explosive mixture of violence, sexual and religious imagery, and explicit language. Here I connect again, which was typified by American artist Lucy Lippard as the most furious artworks of the 20th century. War is inscribed in gender codes. It is in the first place a male war. The same time saw the emergence of the environmental movement. Rachel Carson's influential publication Silent Spring, which first appeared in 1962, functioned as a wake-up call. In the book, Carson describes the future scenario of a spring that dawns without the sound of singing birds, which have fallen victim to the accumulation in the food chain of synthetic pesticides from agriculture. Silent Spring eventually led to a national ban on the carcinogenic pesticide DDT for agricultural use and the creation of the US Environmental Protection Agency. The environmental movement gained further momentum by the publication in 1972 of the Club of Rome's highly influential report Limits to Growth. Using computer simulations, the report showed that on a planet with finite resources, exponential consumption and population growth is impossible. Simultaneously, the print run of Stuart Brand's Whole Earth Catalog, which originated in the countercultures of the American West Coast, approached that of mainstream periodicals. During its brief existence, between 1968 and 1972, close to 2 million copies were sold. Here is an image of the cover of the Whole Earth Catalog from spring 1969 in honor of the Apollo moon landing in 1969. Planet Earth is blue and there's nothing I can do. Well, the whole Earth catalog aimed to provide access to tools for do-it-yourself culture, addressing topics like whole systems, land use, habitation, craft, community, and food production. In those heydays of DIY, every aspiring, self-reliant hippie commune required a self-built geodesic dome modeled after Richard Buckminster Fuller's invention, the so-called Bucky dome, the building instructions of which were disseminated in the whole Earth catalog. Simultaneously, Ian McHarg's groundbreaking publication Designed with Nature from 1967 meant a breakthrough in the fields of landscape architecture, urban and regional planning, and ecological design. As the introduction stated, this user's manual aimed to replace the polluted, bulldozed, machine-dominated, dehumanized, explosion-threatened world that is disappearing before our eyes. It is in this context that a diverse group of primarily American artists started to emerge, often brought together under the umbrella term of ecological art. Ecological art represents a movement in art that, remarkably enough, has been around for decades, but for a long time remained relatively invisible and on the fringes of the more dominant art movements of the time. In the historiography of ecological art, it is often regarded as an offshoot of land art, with pioneers since the late 1960s. Many of the American pioneers in the 1960s and 1970s left the white cube and developed practical site-specific interventions in the landscape context, sculptural solutions to environmental problems, as eco-artist Patricia Johansson, we'll see work of her later, summarized her own work and indirectly also typified this trend. Often applied on a landscape scale, these artist-initiated projects employ innovative strategies to physically transform often degraded local ecological situations. That's a really mouthful. After the Earth Day of 1970, the artist couple Helen Meyer Harrison and Newton Harrison, also known as the Harrisons, had become increasingly aware, had become increasingly ecologically aware. They decided that they would only do work which would benefit the ecosystem in some way. Realizing that fertile topsoil was in danger in many places in the world, Newton Harrison decided to make Earth. He was gathering sand and clay, sewage sludge, cow, chicken and horse manure, leaves, and he threw in some worms. Newton Harrison described the process. I kept turning the earth, which at first had the full smell, dominated by sewage sludge. After almost 4 months, however, the earth developed the rich smell of the forest floor. I actually tasted it, as you can see in the last slide. Engaged as they were in the art and technology movement of the time, from 1971, the Harrisons started to produce a series of so-called survival pieces, indoor farms producing edibles, which were cooked and shared with visitors in a series of museum exhibitions. The series included a portable fish farm, portable orchards, a potato patch, and even a crab farm. In the meantime, American artist Alan Sondfist conceived in 1965 his so-called time landscape, which was physically built in 1978 in Manhattan, New York City. As the title indicates, Sondfist's artwork acts as a time machine. On a 25-foot by 40-foot plot at the corner of LaGuardia Place and West Houston Street in Greenwich Village, he reconstructed and recreated a forest which represents the Manhattan landscape before it was colonized and subsequently urbanized by Dutch settlers in the early 17th century. Sondfist did a lot of research and painstaking efforts to properly recreate the biodiversity of the pre-colonial Manhattan. But perhaps the most known, most prominent representative of this tendency was, of course, Robert Smithson, who in 1971 built his only earthwork in Europe, which is still there until the present day, Broken Circle Spiral Hill. Smithson was charmed not only by the prospect of Broken Circle Spiral Hill in Emmen, of all places, really in the north of the Netherlands. It's a little bit like going to Siberia for Dutch people. He was charmed by the prospect of Broken Circle Spiral Hill forming part of an existing and still functioning sand quarry. And he also really appreciated the fact that the sand lake at the time partly served a public function as an open-air swimming pool. With his interest in unconventional peripheral areas and his anti-romantic vision of nature, Smithson stood at the basis of so-called land reclamation as an artistic endeavor, the reappropriation and redevelopment by artists of land degraded by industrial or otherwise inappropriate human use. In a text from 1971 about his Broken Circle Spiral Hill, Smithson wrote, "A dialectic between land reclamation and mining uses must be established. The artist and the miner must become conscious of themselves as natural agents. The world needs coal and highways, but we do not need the results of strip mining or highway trusts. Economics, when abstracted from the world, is blind to natural processes. Art can become a resource that mediates between the ecologist and the industrialist." Between 1971 and 1973, until his untimely death in 1973 at the age of 35 due to a plane crash on an inspection for his earthwork Amarillo ramp, Smithson met very little enthusiasm for his plans for land reclamation. This is one of the unfinished projects he developed in 1973, Bingham copper mining pit in Utah, which he transformed into a giant draining hole. That was his proposal. With his ideas on land reclamation as an artistic endeavor, the introduction of the notion of entropy, which plays a central role in the second law of thermodynamics in the realm of art, and the establishment of a dialectical relationship between the site, the natural landscape, and the non-site, the museum space, Smithson is often considered as one of the founding fathers of what has been coined as ecological art. With our current standards, however, Smithson was far from an ecological artist, as for instance his plan for an island of broken glass or this asphalt rundown shows. Where Smithson refused to create artworks which would rejuvenate the landscape because he felt that such works would cosmetically camouflage the abuse, other artists went a step further and developed projects to physically clean up the mess. In his pioneering series of revival fields, American artist Mel Chin initiated a collaboration with agrarian scientist Dr. Rufus Cheney in order to clean up toxic waste from urban landfills. In their experimental green remediation project, they employed so-called hyperaccumulators, plants which have the ability to absorb high quantities of heavy metals from the soil through their vascular system. If Robert Smithson is considered to be one of the godfathers of ecological art, these are still some details of the Mel Chin revival field. If he is considered one of the godfathers of ecological art, let's identify some of the godmothers from that era. On the top of my list is certainly Patricia Johansson, who's pictured here on the left together with Georgia O'Keeffe, she was making a studio inventory of all the paintings of O'Keeffe. Incredible stories she can still tell of the encounters she had, especially the very long dinners with Georgia O'Keeffe. Patricia Johansson took the notion of the artist as a catalyst of social and ecological change to the extreme. In order to pull off her projects, she's acting as an intermediary between community groups, environmentalists and other scientists, city planners, funders, etc. Started as a minimalist painter, she was interested in the physical relationship between the viewer and the painting, the experience of color and light. Her paintings, for that reason, continued to expand in size until the point that no white cube could any longer house her paintings. They're paintings with the vanishing point, as you can see in this picture of her work, Stephen Long, 1,600 feet long, almost 500-meter long painting with the vanishing point. Of which the experience would change in different conditions of light and atmosphere. And she became intrigued by the plants and animals which would take refuge in her large-scale outdoor paintings when she was building them. In 1969, Patricia Johansson was invited by the American country living magazine House and Garden, her so-called House and Garden commission, to design a simple backdoor garden. It sparked an incredible, productive group of works. In less than 6 months, she produced over 150 drawings proposing sculptural solutions to environmental problems such as erosion, sedimentation, water conservation, flooding, sewage treatment, landfills, and habitat loss. Here I'm just showing some of them. I realize that we're really in short of time, so I go through them quickly. The first one, the regional highway garden in the form of a nude, living apartment houses, a sculpted floodplain which would clean the water of a river, a really beautiful line garden for Capability Brown, the British landscape designer, and last but not least, a garden of sulfur and tar for Bob, the title says. Who is Bob? That's Bob Smithson, Robert Smithson, a close friend of hers. The second line is this formal artificial garden should never be built. She was really opposing that very polluting practice of her friend Robert Smithson. It was only in the 80s that she was able to physically build those projects. She basically developed her whole program in that series in 1969, but it took her many, many years to get the first projects built. The worst thing you could say to Patricia Johansson is that these are utopian or visionary projects. They're designed to be built. That's her main thing. In 1981, the first piece she realized, Fair Lagoon Park in Dallas, in the city center of Dallas, Texas, a piece in the shape of two iconic plants from the area, reviving and ecologically restoring a dead lagoon where basically all the life had died because of algae bloom. And one of the components of her structure, the structure she designed and built, was not only to get people, city people and nature close together, as you can see in some of these images, but also to provide habitat and to prevent flood erosion or shoreline erosion. When there were heavy winds, there was an incredible shoreline erosion. And basically, the whole structure of the sculpture is built in such a way that it functions as a giant wave breaker for the waves which started there. just showing some of some incredible pictures which I still like. She reintroduced 5 different species of turtle as a part of it, and incredible project, very complicated project. Here's a more recent project of the same artist, Patricia Johansson, Ellis Creek Water Recycling Facility in Petaluma, California. As you can see on this design, the overall design is again in the shape of an iconic animal. In this case, the so-called salt marsh harvest mouse, a local mouse which resides in the marsh area, and which he tried to restore. And as you can see in the build plan, these are some aerial photographs of the built thing. The whole structure functions as a giant sewage water recycling facility where the dirty water is arriving at the rear of the mouse, and by gravity with conventional water facilities demand a lot of energy use, a lot of pumping of water. Basically, her whole design functions by gravity, avoiding high energy use. There's a lot to say about it, but I don't have time, unfortunately. In 1982, I'm moving to some other artists. In 1982, Agnes de Nes was growing wheat on a 4-acre landfill parcel near the World Trade Center in New York, juxtaposing the activities of the city and the countryside. She maintained and irrigated the field for over 4 months, harvesting almost 1,000 pounds of wheat in August. One of the most common crops grown around the world, the wheat field, a confrontation called attention to hunger and mismanagement of resources, just a few blocks away from the New York Stock Exchange. You can see the World Trade Center in the background. The highly engendered discipline of maintenance art, which American artist Merrill Lademan Ecologies developed, focuses on issues like urban waste, recycling, and landfill reclamation. In 1969, after becoming a mother, she wrote her maintenance art manifesto, acknowledging the drudgery involved in maintenance activities as cleaning, washing, and mending, while recognizing their importance for sustaining life. She started to stage performances, such as the one you see here, in which she was painstakingly washing the sidewalks of New York City. Since 1977, she became a long-term artist in residence at the New York City Department of Sanitation. Here you see an image of her action Touch Sanitation, an 11-month performance, shaking the hands of every sanitation worker in New York City and thanking them to keep the city clean. Ecologies focuses on sanitation workers who she feels are stigmatized because we, the public, are generally unwilling to recognize that the individuals who take the garbage don't make the garbage. In order to reflect this issue, Ecologies created, here is one more image of that beautiful touch sanitation. She still has a lot of handshakes to go, as you see. In order to reflect this issue, Ecologies created the social mirror, a sanitation truck covered with mirrored glass. While the vehicle moved to the streets of Manhattan, the reflection of city residents were beamed back to them. The people responsible for the garbage glut were cast squarely in the limelight, as one author remarked. Betsy Damon's work was informed by her activism since the 1970s for women's rights, lesbian rights, and environmental rights. She started as a performance artist, and of which the 7,000-year-old woman, you see an image here, is most generally known. The performance addressed numerous feminist themes which would recur in her work, including ritual, violence against women, and attainment of self-knowledge. Her later work is marked by water activism, affirming the life-sustaining properties of water and addressing issues like water scarcity and pollution. In Chengdu, China, she built the Living Water Garden on the site of an ancient river diversion system on the Fu and Nan rivers. A giant sculpture in the shape of a fish, a symbol of regeneration in Chinese culture. The work is a fully functioning natural water treatment plant, a living environmental education center, and a refuge for plants and wildlife. And the structure cleans 250 cubic meters of water daily in a 7-stage biological water cleaning process. The importance of water for all life on our planet is also the starting point for the work of American artist Basha Erland. The objects which he produces are often reliquaries of actions. They contain the memories of participatory projects dedicated to the mutual interconnectedness of people and all phenomena within the cosmos. Many works bear witness to a nomadic worldview with a deep understanding of different cultures. During international treks along rivers, the Gathering of Waters series originated as a way to reconnect a multitude of community groups with their local waterways and focus on collaborative and locally based actions encompassing an ethic of inclusion. These projects often result in portable repositories in which the knowledge and experience of waterways are assembled. Rest assured, the end is near. The legacy of these highly engendered, socio-politically charged activist eco-art, which originated in the late 60s and 70s, may, for instance, be found in the work of the current artist collective, the Yes Men, named after the popular term for obedient, subordinated kantoor or office clerks, ja-knikkers. This provocative duo, the New York-based artist Andy Bichelbaum and Mike Bonanno, create spectacular and bold interventions in conferences and on television to draw attention to the ways in which multinational companies ignore human rights, democracy, and the environment. The Yes Men employ a strategy that they have dubbed identity correction. In cheap suits, Bichelbaum and Bonanno pose as the dominant white male representatives of big corporations they don't like. With biting satire, they cross boundaries to ask moral questions about how companies and politicians abuse their power. Here you see one of those wonderful interventions. Very conservative. They made a fake version, a mock-up version of the New York Post. From the beginning to the end, it's all fake. It's all written by them. We are screwed, which is on the cover. Very conservative newspaper, very skeptical to climate change, and they produced just before one of those main global conferences on climate change, they produced this fake version of the New York Post, which they were distributing. Almost at the end. Several authors have pointed out that ecological art constitutes one of the most pluralistic art movements in terms of form and content, which has undoubtedly contributed greatly to the fact that more than 50 years after its inception, this art practice is still hardly noticed or acknowledged in art historical overviews. Why did this historical art movement hardly get a following amongst other younger generations of artists? The reasons may be multiple. Lack of art and ecology programs at art schools, How can traditional art academies train highly interdisciplinary eco-artists? A lack of exposure, museum exposure and art press, stylistically inconsistent movement, and of course the often large-scale projects which are incredibly hard to get financed for, especially for younger generations of artists, of course. Facing our current enormous ecological, socio-political and economic challenges, we'll urgently need to develop new models and worldviews of complexity, mutual connection and global interdependence. Processes of reimagining and envisioning are considered crucial tools in order to develop more sustainable alternatives for the future. We'll need to change from what is to what if. As the founder of the global transition movement, Rob Hopkins, titled his most recent publication. The arts are preeminently a field in which envisioning and reimagining occupy a central place, and many critical artists who have been at the forefront of major socio-political movements and shifts as public intellectuals and agents of change. In the age of the Anthropocene, we'll urgently need to rediscover these pioneering artists and their innovative work, which should follow suit among younger generations of artists. Thank you for your attention.